So, gentlemen, why don't you tell us what you know, share with us what you know about the current situation?
Ray, age before, anyway.
Age before beauty.
Yeah.
Well, I know about the latest full overture by the Ecuadorian government. And I know about Christine, Julian's mother, who, well, people should be able to identify with the pain of a mother who watches what is happening to her son. And I can't help but reiterate my feeling that, we need to do something more than commiserate, more than talk. I revert to my NOAA principle, which is no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. And it would be my hope that as we discuss things here, we keep that most in mind and figure out what piece of the arc we can put together and how we really need to float it and not worry about more rain.
Well, every time we do these vigils, we say it's a very critical moment, and it keeps becoming even more and more critical. We've had quite a lot of news, actually, since the last one, I believe, including the existence of the charges in the Eastern District of Virginia, where Ray and I happen to be right now. And we don't know what they are. We know they exist because there's an attempt to have them unsealed, and the judge hasn't ruled yet. But if the Espionage Act is in fact what they're going to charge, or already have charged Julian Assange with, we could thank the changes over the years in this act. Just to say that people ask, how could Julian Assange, an Australian citizen working outside the U.S., fall under U.S. jurisdiction? And if the original 1917 Act was still in force, they would not be able to, because that made it clear in 1917 that the crime against the Espionage Act had to take place on U.S. territory, on a U.S. ship, or on the high seas. But in 1961, some congressman got upset about a State Department official who was blackmailed in Poland, and he pushed for an amendment which made this a global act, part of the extending U.S. Jurisdiction around the whole globe, as they tried to dominate it. And so I've made the point on those appearances that Susie mentioned, this same point that I'm going to make here, that even though legally they have a case against, by the letter of that law, which is a horrible law, they could go after him. The issue is politically, because the Constitution, the First Amendment, the way I see it, and the Pentagon Papers case made it clear, is only about prior restraint. In other words, the government can't tell a newspaper or a TV station to stop printing something before it's published. That's what the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the Washington Post in the Pentagon Papers case. But the judges on that Supreme Court, the majority, wrote an opinion that after publication, they were liable to be prosecuted for publishing classified information. The original act, and continuing until today, makes it a crime to even possess classified information, so that they don't have to prove Julian had anything to do with stealing the emails or any of these classified documents from Chelsea Manning, for example, just that he possessed and disseminated them as a crime. But it's not been prosecuted ever for political reasons, and on the impact it would have on the rest of the media, the mainstream media, because that would make the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post, all media, all journalists, liable for the prosecution under this act, which, as I say, legally they can. Politically, it's never been something any administration tried to do. For example, Senator Mike Gravel, who was given the papers by Dan Ellsberg and read them in Congress, later published them in Beacon Press in Boston. And he told me personally, because we wrote a book about this together, that he was scared that Nixon could come after him, but they laid off. Same thing happened, and Ray knows more about the Morrison case than I do. Casey wanted to go after the several newspapers that published information, and he backed off. And then there was Obama, who wanted to try to prosecute Julian Assange, but they called it their New York Times problem, which meant that if they prosecuted Assange, which they can do legally, they would have a big problem, because the Times, how could they get away with it if they went after Assange? So they backed off. I'm worried that the Trump administration, Trump in particular, with his manic hatred of the press, a lot of it legitimate as criticism, but he might actually go for this prosecution, especially Pompeo And what he said about Assange and WikiLeaks makes you wonder that if he is arrested, they could actually try to prosecute him. Now, the death penalty, by the way, in the act is only about war, in times of war. They could argue that in Iraq, the Iraq collateral damage tapes and the Afghan cables could be considered a time of war. So we have to worry a lot about that. And of course, we know now that President Lenin Moreno of Ecuador has said that he made a deal, he's agreement from the UK that they won't extradite Assange to a country that would execute him, not a country that has the death penalty. He's not saying a country, if you have the death penalty, I don't want you to have him extradited, just that they won't execute him, which is chilling to talk about it at all. So that's the scary part we're at right now. Also, we know that Paul Manafort, who did not meet with with Julian Assange in the embassy, despite what Luke Harding has written, did try to make a deal with Moreno at one point. And as I said on one of these programs before, and I said I thought they were negotiating. If Ecuador, a small country, has something the United States, the most powerful country, really wants, well, he's going to hold out to get a good deal. You want something I have? And in fact, from what's been reported, Moreno wanted debt relief and investments. That's what you normally would want in exchange for Assange. Now, maybe a deal has been made because we're closing in, and I'll close right here by saying we're closing in on what could be the most critical moment in all of this, where they're trying to make the circumstances under which Julian Assange is living so terrible that he would leave. But Stefania Morici from La Repubblica saw him about 10 days ago in the embassy, and I communicated with her, and she told me she's under the strong impression he won't leave no matter what they do to him. So they're going to have to do a politically troubling act in terms of the way it'll be seen by entering with the Ecuadorian government's permission to seize him. And we really all hope here, of course, that doesn't happen.
The key problem here, I would simply add to what Joe said, is to get evidence that could allow them to detour around the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment, of course, is the bedrock of our freedom. And so nobody wants to mess with the First Amendment if indeed, as Joe pointed out, the New York Times and the Washington Post would be equally liable. And so what they need to do is find the missing link. And what's the missing link? The missing link is proof that Julian Assange solicited, for example, the emails from the Democratic National Committee, that he was actively witting and eager and told Seth Rich or whoever it was, please give me those things because I want to destroy Hillary. Well, guess what? That evidence doesn't exist. And President Obama, 2 days before he left office, admitted that. He said, the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to how the Russian hacking got to WikiLeaks are inconclusive. So you have Obama admitting that there were inconclusive conclusions with respect to how WikiLeaks got these documents. I mean, that's a pretty big gap, right? So, in my view, they'll fill in the missing link. It's just too embarrassing for them for Julian to sit there and still receive incredibly damaging leaks like Vault 7. We could talk about that later, and publish them. It's just so damaging that they'll figure out something. They'll figure out something like, aluminum tubes, or maybe yellow cake uranium. It's very easy to fabricate and intercept a message. My full expectation is that they'll do that. And they'll do that and make believe that Julian Assange actively solicited Russian hacking, and that way they can get him and avoid the implications of going after him on First Amendment grounds. So I agree with Joe. I think the situation is really, really delicate. And I'm thinking again that we need to do something more than converse here. And hopefully some wisdom will come out, wisdom that escapes me at the moment.